The 12-Day Madness, the manhunt that forged a nation. Prologue, The Last Laugh. The sound that changed America forever was not a scream, nor a thunderclap, but a wave of laughter. It was roughly 10:15 p.m. on Good Friday, April 14, 1865. Inside the plush, gas-lit interior of Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., 1,000 people were roaring with amusement. On stage, actor Harry Hawk, playing the character Asa Trenchard in the comedy Our American Cousin, had just delivered the play's funniest line. He stood alone on the boards and shouted at a scheming mother-in-law character who had just exited. "Don't know the manners of good society, eh? Well, I guess I know enough to turn you inside out, old gal, you sockdologizing old man-trap." The audience erupted. It was a release of tension 4 years in the making. The Civil War was effectively over. Robert E. Lee had surrendered at Appomattox just 5 days prior. The air in the Capitol was electric with relief, victory, and the promise of peace. In the presidential box, adorned with silk flags and a framed portrait of George Washington, President Abraham Lincoln leaned forward, a smile creasing his weary, bearded face. He sat in a rocking chair, his hand resting on the knee of his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln. It was the perfect cover. In the darkness of the vestibule behind the box, a 26-year-old man named John Wilkes Booth waited for that specific line. He was an actor. He knew the play by heart. He knew the laughter would drown out the click of a hammer and the report of a gun. He was handsome, famous, and possessed by a fanatical hatred that had curdled into madness. As the laughter hit its crescendo, Booth opened the door. He stepped into the box, leveled a single-shot .44 caliber Derringer pistol at the back of the president's head, and squeezed the trigger. The sound was a muffled pop, swallowed by the guffaws of the crowd. For a split second, history hung in suspension. The president slumped forward. Major Henry Rathbone, a guest in the box, lunged at the intruder. Booth dropped the pistol and drew a hunting knife, slashing Rathbone's arm to the bone. Then came the leap. Booth placed his hand on the railing of the box and vaulted over, intending to land triumphantly on the stage 12 feet below. But his spur caught on the Treasury flag draping the box. He landed awkwardly, the tibia in his left leg snapping with a sickening crunch. Adrenaline masking the agony, Booth scrambled to center stage. He raised the bloody knife above his head, his eyes wild, and shouted the motto of Virginia, words that would echo through history. Sic semper tyrannius, that is, thus always to tyrants. Then he added in English, "The South is avenged." He ran off stage, into the wings, and out the back door into the alley where a bay mare was waiting. Behind him, the laughter in the theater died, replaced by a confused murmur, and then a piercing scream from Mary Todd Lincoln that shattered the peace of the night. The president was dying. The assassin was loose. The greatest manhunt in American history had begun. Chapter 1. The City of Chaos. Washington, D.C. descended into immediate insanity. As news spread from Ford's Theater, it moved like a shockwave. Lincoln is shot. Seward is dead. The vice president is targeted. Secretary of State William Seward had indeed been attacked in his bed by Booth's conspirator Lewis Powell the same night, turned into a bloody mess but miraculously surviving. Rumors flew that the Confederate Army had regrouped and was marching on the Capitol. Soldiers flooded the streets. The telegraph lines began to hum with a frantic energy. In the midst of this bedlam, one man became the de facto ruler of the United States, Edwin M. Stanton, the Secretary of War. While Lincoln lay unconscious in a small boarding house across the street from the theater, breathing raggedly, Stanton set up a command post in the back parlor. He was a man of steel and fury. "Lock down the city," Stanton barked at the trembling officers. "Close every bridge, search every train. No one leaves Washington." But he was too late. Just minutes before the lockdown order reached the sentries, a lone rider approached the Navy Yard Bridge, the primary route south into Maryland. The sentry, Sergeant Silas T. Cobb, stopped the horseman. "Who are you?" Cobb demanded. "My name is Booth," the rider replied, surprisingly truthful. "I am going home to Charles County." "You are not allowed to pass after 9 o'clock," Cobb said. Booth smiled, a charming actor smile that hid the throbbing pain in his broken leg. "I did not know the rule. I've been in the city for business." Cobb hesitated. The rider seemed like a gentleman. He was not to know this man had just put a bullet in the brain of the president. "Pass," Cobb said, stepping aside. 5 minutes later, a second rider appeared, David Harold, a dim-witted admirer of Booth and his co-conspirator. He, too, talked his way past Cobb. By the time the third rider appeared, a messenger carrying the news of the assassination, the bridge was firmly barricaded. The irony was bitter. The blockade kept the news in, while the killer was already riding into the dark, swampy embrace of Maryland. Chapter 2. The Broken Leg. Booth and Harold met on the road. The adrenaline was fading for Booth, replaced by a white-hot agony in his leg. Every hoofbeat of his horse sent a jolt of torture through his body. He needed a doctor. They rode through the night, deep into the Maryland countryside, a place teeming with Confederate sympathizers. Booth believed he would be hailed as a hero, a modern-day Brutus who had slain the American Caesar. He fantasized about the Southern newspapers praising his courage. Around 4 a.m. on Saturday, April 15th, they arrived at the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd. Mudd was a country doctor who had met Booth before, though he would later deny it. He cut the boot off Booth's swollen leg and set the bone. While Booth lay in Mudd's upstairs bedroom, miles away in Washington, Abraham Lincoln took his last breath at 7:22 a.m. Stanton, standing by the bedside, uttered the famous epitaph, "Now he belongs to the ages." The telegraph wire screamed the news to the world. The president is dead. Back in Mudd's house, Booth shaved off his famous mustache to alter his appearance. He and Harold stayed for hours, resting. But by the afternoon, Mudd had gone into town for supplies and realized the enormity of what had happened. Soldiers were swarming the countryside. Harboring the president's killer was a death sentence. Mudd returned home, terrified. He ordered the two men to leave. Booth, crippled and feverish, climbed back onto his horse. They disappeared into the Zaccaia Swamp, a treacherous labyrinth of bogs, briars, and quicksand. Chapter 3. The Hunters and the Hunted. The Hunt Man was now under the command of Colonel Lafayette Baker, a ruthless detective who served Stanton. Thousands of Union cavalry were combing the woods of Maryland. A reward of $100,000, a fortune in 1865, was posted. Booth and Harold spent 5 days hiding in a pine thicket. They were cold, hungry, and terrified. Their only contact with the outside world was Thomas Jones, a Confederate agent who brought them food and newspapers. It was in that damp, dark thicket that Booth's spirit broke. He eagerly snatched the newspapers Jones brought him, expecting to read of his glory. Instead, he read of universal condemnation. The South did not cheer him. They feared his act would bring a harsh vengeance from the North. Even the Confederate generals denounced the murder. He was not Brutus. He was a coward who shot an unarmed man from behind. Booth took out his little red diary and scribbled his defense, his handwriting shaky with pain and despair. I struck for my country, and that alone, a country that groaned beneath this tyranny. I am here in despair. And why? For doing what Brutus was honored for, and yet I, for striking down a greater tyrant than they ever knew, am looked upon as a common cutthroat? Meanwhile, the net was tightening. The Union cavalry had found Dr. Mudd. Under interrogation, Mudd cracked enough to give them a direction. The soldiers moved toward the Potomac River. On the night of April 20th, Thomas Jones decided it was time to move. He put Booth and Herold in a small boat and pointed them toward Virginia, across the wide Potomac. "Keep the candle low," he whispered, "and Godspeed." But in the fog and darkness, they lost their way. Instead of reaching Virginia, they rode in a circle and landed back in Maryland. They had to hide for another day, terrified, before finally making the crossing the next night. Chapter 4. The Tobacco Barn. By April 24th, 10 days after the assassination, Booth and Herold had made it into Virginia. They posed as Confederate soldiers returning home. They sought shelter at the farm of Richard Garrett near Port Royal. Garrett, unaware of their identity, took them in. Booth claimed to be a wounded soldier named James W. Boyd. But the Union cavalry was relentless. A tip had led them to the ferry crossing where Booth had passed. Lieutenant Edward Dougherty, leading the 16th New York Cavalry, was closing in. On the night of April 20th, Booth and Herold were sleeping in the Garrett's tobacco barn. They had been spooked by the passing of cavalry earlier in the day and refused to sleep in the house. The Garrett sons, suspicious that the men might steal their horses, locked the barn door from the outside. At 2 a.m. on April 26th, the sound of galloping hooves thundered down the lane. The soldiers surrounded the farmhouse. They dragged Old Man Garrett out of bed and put a pistol to his head. "Where are the men?" the officer demanded. Garrett stammered, pointing to the barn. "They are in there! They are in there!" The soldiers surrounded the barn. It was a wooden structure, dry as tinder. Lieutenant Dougherty called out, "Surrender and you will be treated fairly. If you don't come out, we will set fire to the barn." Inside, Booth stood up, leaning on a crutch. He was cornered. "Captain," he shouted, his voice strong and theatrical to the end, "give a lame man a chance. Draw up your men 50 yards from the door, and I will come out and fight you all." The soldiers refused. "Well, my brave boys," Booth yelled, "prepare a stretcher for me." David Herold, terrified, began to bang on the door. "Let me out! I want to surrender!" "You damned coward!" Booth hissed at him. "Go then, go! I will not be taken alive." Herold was let out. The soldiers grabbed him and tied him to a tree. Now only Booth remained. Detective Everton Conger, one of the leaders of the pursuit, crept to the back of the barn and lit a pile of straw. The fire caught instantly. The flames licked up the dry wooden walls, illuminating the interior like a stage set. Through the cracks in the wood, the soldiers could see Booth. He was standing in the center of the inferno, leaning on a crutch, a carbine rifle in his hands. The firelight danced in his eyes. He looked like a demon in the pit of hell. Outside, a sergeant named Boston Corbett watched through a gap in the planks. Corbett was a deeply religious, eccentric man, a Mad Hatter by trade before the war. He had orders not to shoot. Stanton wanted Booth alive for questioning. But as Booth raised his rifle, appearing to aim at the door, Corbett felt God guiding his hand. He raised his Colt revolver, aimed through the crack, and fired.
Chapter 5. Useless, Useless. The bullet struck Booth in the neck, severing his spinal cord. It was nearly the exact same spot where his bullet had struck Lincoln. Booth dropped instantly. The soldiers rushed in, dragging his body out of the burning barn before the roof collapsed. They laid him on the porch of the Garrett farmhouse. He was paralyzed. He could not move his arms or legs, but he was conscious. The pain was excruciating. "Kill me," he whispered to the soldiers. "Kill me!" "We don't want to kill you," a doctor said, kneeling beside him. "We want you to get well." But Booth knew it was over. As the sun began to rise on the morning of April 26, 1865, the life faded from the man who had plunged a nation into mourning. In his final moments, Booth asked the soldiers to lift his hands so he could see them. He stared at his own hands, the hands of an actor, the hands of a killer. His lips moved one last time. "Useless, useless." John Wilkes Booth died at 7:15 a.m., just as the sun broke fully over the Virginia horizon. Epilogue. The Aftermath. The body of John Wilkes Booth was brought back to Washington, D.C. aboard a monitor ship. An autopsy was performed on the deck to confirm his identity. He was buried initially in a secret grave under the floor of the old penitentiary, so no Confederates could worship at his tomb. 4 of his co-conspirators, including David Herold and Mary Surratt, the first woman executed by the U.S. federal government, were hanged on July 7, 1865. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln did not save the South. Instead, it doomed the Reconstruction era. Without Lincoln's guiding hand of malice toward none with charity for all, the reintegration of the Union became a bitter, painful struggle that lasted for decades. But the story of those 12 days, the chase through the swamps, the burning barn, the madness of a man who wanted to be a hero but died a villain, remains one of the most gripping chapters in American history. It serves as a reminder of how the actions of a single individual, fueled by hate and delusion, can alter the destiny of millions.